In 1830, a group of Indian nations collectively referred to as the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muscogee, and Seminole nations, were living autonomously in what would later be termed the American Deep South. The process of cultural transformation from their traditional way of life towards a white American way of life, as proposed by George Washington and Henry Knox, was gaining momentum, especially among the Cherokee and Choctaw. American settlers had been pressuring the federal government to remove Indians from the Southeast. Many settlers were encroaching on Indian lands, while others wanted more land made available to the settlers. Although the effort was vehemently opposed by some, including U.S. Congressman Davy Crockett of Tennessee, President Andrew Jackson was able to gain congressional passage of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which authorized the government to extinguish any Indian title to land claims in the Southeast. In 1831, the Choctaw became the first nation to be removed, and their removal served as the model for all future relocations. After 2 wars, many Seminoles were removed in 1832. The Creek removal followed in 1834, the Chickasaw in 1837, and lastly the Cherokee in 1838. Some managed to evade the removals, however, and remained in their ancestral homelands. Some Choctaw still reside in Mississippi, Creek in Alabama, and Florida, Cherokee in North Carolina, and Seminole in Florida. A small group of Seminole, fewer than 500, evaded forced removal. The modern Seminole nation of Florida is descended from these individuals. A small number of non-Indians who lived with the nations, including over 4,000. Slaves and others of African descent, such as spouses or freedmen, also accompanied the Indians on the trek westward. By 1837, 46,000 Indians from the southeastern states had been removed from their homelands, thereby opening 25 million acres, 100,000 square kilometers for white settlement. When the 5 tribes arrived in Indian territory, they followed their physical appropriation of Plains Indians' land, with an erasure of their predecessors' history, and perpetuated the idea that they had found an undeveloped wilderness when they arrived, in an attempt to appeal to white American values by participating in the settler colonial process themselves. Other Indian nations, such as the Quapaws and Osages, had moved to Indian territory before the 5 tribes and saw them as intruders. Historical background. Before 1838, the fixed boundaries of these autonomous Indian nations, comprising large areas of the United States, were subject to continual cession and annexation, in part due to pressure from squatters and the threat of military force in the newly declared U.S. territory as federally administered regions whose boundaries supervened upon the Indian treaty claims. As these territories became U.S. states, state governments sought to dissolve the boundaries of the Indian nations within their borders, which were independent of state jurisdiction, and to expropriate the land therein. These pressures were exacerbated by U.S. population growth and the expansion of slavery in the South, with the rapid development of cotton cultivation in the uplands after the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney. Many people of the southeastern Indian nations had become economically integrated into the economy of the region. This included the plantation economy and the possession of slaves, who were also forcibly relocated during the removal. Prior to Jackson's presidency, removal policy was already in place and justified by the myth of the vanishing Indian. Historian Jeffrey Osler explains that scholars have exposed how the discourse of the vanishing Indian was an ideology that made declining indigenous American populations seem to be an inevitable consequence of natural processes and so allowed Americans to evade moral responsibility for their destructive choices. Despite the common association of Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears, ideas for removal began prior to Jackson's presidency. Osler explains, a singular focus on Jackson obscures the fact that he did not invent the idea of removal months after the passage of the Removal Act. Jackson described the legislation as the happy consummation of a policy pursued for nearly 30 years. James Fenimore Cooper was also a key component of the maintenance of the vanishing Indian myth. This vanishing narrative can be seen as existing prior to the Trail of Tears through Cooper's novel, The Last of the Mohicans. Scholar and author Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz Shostat, Cooper has the last of the noble and pure natives die off, as nature would have it. With the last Mohican handing the continent over to Hawkeye, the nativized settler, his adopted son. Cooper had much to do with creating the us origin myth, to which generations of historians have dedicated themselves, fortifying what historian Francis Jennings has described as exclusion from the process of formation of American society and culture. Jackson's role. Although Jackson was not the sole or original architect of removal policy, his contributions were influential in its trajectory. Jackson's support for the removal of the Indians began at least a decade before his presidency. Indian removal was Jackson's top legislative priority upon taking office. After being elected president, he wrote in his first address to Congress, "The emigration should be voluntary, for it would be as cruel as unjust to compel the Aborigines to abandon the graves of their fathers and seek a home in a distant land. But they should be distinctly informed that if they remain within the limits of the states, they must be subject to their laws. In return for their obedience as individuals, they will without doubt be protected in the enjoyment of those possessions which they have improved by their industry." The prioritization of American Indian removal and his violent past created a sense of restlessness among U.S. territories. During his presidency, the United States made 86 treaties with 26 American Indian nations between New York and the Mississippi, all of them forcing land cessions, including removals. In a speech regarding Indian removal, Jackson said, "It will separate the Indians from immediate contact with settlements of whites, free them from the power of the states, enable them to pursue happiness in their own way and under their own rude institutions, will retard the progress of decay, which is lessening their numbers, and perhaps cause them gradually, under the protection of the government and through the influence of good counsels, to cast off their savage habits and become an interesting, civilized, and Christian community." The removals, conducted under both Presidents Jackson and Van Buren, followed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which provided the president with powers to exchange land with Indian nations and provide infrastructure improvements on the existing lands. The law also gave the president power to pay for transportation costs to the West, should the nations willingly choose to relocate. The law did not, however, allow the president to force Indian nations to move west without a mutually agreed upon treaty. Referring to the Indian Removal Act, Martin Van Buren, Jackson's vice president and successor, is quoted as saying, "There was no measure in the whole course of Jackson's administration, of which he was more exclusively the author than this." According to historian Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, Jackson's intentions were outwardly violent. Dunbar Ortiz claims that Jackson believed in bleeding enemies to give them their senses on his quest to serve the goal of U.S. expansion. According to her, American Indians presented an obstacle to the fulfillment of manifest destiny in his mind. Throughout his military career, according to historian Amy H. Sturgis, Jackson earned and emphasized his reputation as an Indian fighter, a man who believed creating fear in the native population was more desirable than cultivating friendship. In a message to Congress on the eve of Indian removal, December 6, 1830, Jackson wrote that removal will relieve the whole state of Mississippi and the western part of Alabama of Indian occupancy, and enable those states to advance rapidly in population, wealth, and power. It will separate the Indians from immediate contact with settlements of whites. In this way, Sturgis has argued that Jackson demarcated the Indian population as an obstacle to national success. Sturgis writes that Jackson's removal policies were met with pushback from respectable social figures, and that many leaders of Jacksonian reform movements were particularly disturbed by U.S. policy toward American Indians. Among these opponents were women's advocate and founder of the American Women's Educational Association, Catherine Beecher, and politician Davy Crockett. Historian Francis Paul Procha, on the other hand, writes that these assessments were put forward by Jackson's political opponents and that Jackson had benevolent intentions. According to him, Jackson's critics have been too harsh, if not wrong. He states that Jackson never developed a doctrinaire anti-Indian attitude, and that his dominant goal was to preserve the security and well-being of the United States and its Indian and white inhabitants. Corroborating Procha's interpretation, historian Robert V. Rimini argues that Jackson never intended for the monstrous result of his policy. Rimini argues further that had Jackson not orchestrated the removal of the 5 civilized tribes from their ancestral homelands, they would have been totally wiped out. Treaty of New Echota. Jackson chose to continue with Indian removal and negotiated the Treaty of New Echota on December 29, 1835, which granted the Cherokee 2 years to move to Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma. The Chickasaws and Choctaws had readily accepted and signed treaties with the U.S. government, while the Creeks did so under coercion. The negotiation of the Treaty of New Echota was largely encouraged by Jackson, and it was signed by a minority Cherokee political faction, the Treaty Party led by Cherokee leader Elias Boudinot. However, the treaty was opposed by most of the Cherokee people, as it was not approved by the Cherokee National Council, and it was not signed by Principal Chief John Ross. The Cherokee National Council submitted a petition signed by thousands of Cherokee citizens, urging Congress to void the agreement in February 1836. Despite this opposition, the Senate ratified the treaty on March 1836, and the Treaty of New Echota thus became the legal basis for the Trail of Tears. Only a fraction of the Cherokees left voluntarily. The U.S. government, with assistance from state militias, forced most of the remaining Cherokees west in 1838. The Cherokees were temporarily remanded in camps in eastern Tennessee. In November, the Cherokee were broken into groups of around 1,000 each and began the journey west. They endured heavy rains, snow, and freezing temperatures. When the Cherokee negotiated the Treaty of New Echota, they exchanged all their land east of the Mississippi for land in modern Oklahoma and a $5 million payment from the federal government. Many Cherokee felt betrayed that their leadership accepted the deal, and over 16,000 Cherokee signed a petition to prevent the passage of the treaty. By the end of the decade in 1840, tens of thousands of Cherokee and other Indian nations had been removed from their land east of the Mississippi River. The Creek, Choctaw, Seminole, and Chickasaw were also relocated under the Indian Removal Act of 1830. One Choctaw leader portrayed the removal as a trail of tears and deaths. a devastating event that removed most of the Indian population of the Southeastern United States from their traditional homelands. Terminology. The forced relocations and ethnic cleansings of the Indian nations have sometimes been referred to as death marches. In particular, when referring to the Cherokee march across Tennessee, Kentucky, and Missouri in 1838. Indians who had the means initially provided for their own removal. Contingents that were led by conductors from the U.S. Army included those led by Edward Dease, who was claimed to be a sympathizer for the Cherokee plight. The largest death toll from the Cherokee forced relocation comes from the period after the May 23, 1838 deadline. This was at the point when the remaining Cherokee were rounded up into camps and placed into large groups, often over 700 in size. Communicable diseases spread quickly through these closely quartered groups, killing many. These groups were among the last to move, but following the same routes the others had taken. The areas they were going through had been depleted of supplies due to the vast numbers that had gone before them. The marchers were subject to extortion and violence along the route. In addition, these final contingents were forced to set out during the hottest and coldest months of the year, killing many. Exposure to the elements, disease, starvation, harassment by local frontiersmen, and insufficient rations similarly killed up to 1/3 of the Choctaw and other nations on the march. There exists some debate among historians and the affected nations as to whether the term Trail of Tears should be used to refer to the entire history of forced relocations from the eastern United States into Indian Territory to the relocations of specifically the 5 civilized tribes to the route of the march, or to specific marches in which the remaining holdouts from each area were rounded up. Classification as genocide. There has been debate among scholars about whether Indian removal and the Trail of Tears were genocidal acts. Historian Jeffrey Osler argues that even when genocide was not unequivocally carried out, the threat of genocide was used to ensure natives' compliance with removal policies, and concludes that, in its outcome and in the means used to gain compliance, the policy had genocidal dimensions. Patrick Wolfe argues that settler colonialism and genocide are interrelated, but should be distinguished from each other, writing that settler colonialism is more than the summary liquidation of indigenous people, though it includes that. Wolfe describes the assimilation of indigenous people who escaped relocation, and particularly their abandonment of collectivity, as a form of cultural genocide, though he emphasizes that cultural genocide is the real thing and that it resulted in large numbers of deaths. The Trail of Tears was thus a settler colonial replacement of indigenous people and culture, in addition to a genocidal mass killing, according to Wolfe. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz describes the policy as genocide, quoting Cherokee Principal Chief Wilma Mankiller. The fledgling United States government's method of dealing with native people process, which then included systematic genocide, property theft, and total subjugation, reached its nadir in 1830 under the federal policy of President Andrew Jackson. Mankiller emphasizes that Jackson's policies were the natural extension of much earlier genocidal policies toward Native Americans, established through territorial expansion during the Jefferson administration. Dina Gilio Whitaker, in As Long as Grass Grows, describes the Trail of Tears and the Din Long Walk as structural genocide, because they destroyed native relations to land, one another, and non-human beings, which imperiled their culture, life, and history. According to her, these are ongoing actions that constitute both cultural and physical genocide. Colonial historian Daniel Blake Smith disagrees with the usage of the term genocide, adding that no one wanted, let alone planned for, Cherokees to die in the forced removal out west. Historian Justin D. Murphy argues that, although the Trail of Tears was tragic, it does not quite meet the standard of genocide, and the extent to which tribes were allowed to retain their identity, albeit by removal, does not quite meet the standard of cultural genocide.